Thank you very much for coming to this important event here at UT. I'm James Lopez. I'm the co-director of the Center for Jose Marti Studies here at the University of Tampa. And I'd like to especially thank the Honors Program, the College of Arts and Letters, and the College of Social Sciences, Mathematics, and Education for helping us put this event together. And I also thank you all in advance for putting your cell phones on silent. It's a great privilege of the Center for Jose Marti Studies affiliate to bring our distinguished guest, Dr. Alfred J. Lopez, to the University of Tampa. Dr. Lopez is the interim head of the School of Interdisciplinary Studies and the director of Latin American and Latino Studies at Purdue University. He is the founding editor of the Global South, a leading journal of globalization and global South studies, and his many articles have appeared in the top journals in his field. Among his 6 published and upcoming books is the one that concerns us here today. Jose Marti, A Revolutionary Life, is the first English-language biography of the great Cuban writer and patriot. And an argument could be made that it is the best one of all, or at least the most relevant and useful to us in our current moment. Now, for those of you in the audience who are not too familiar with Jose Marti, allow me to provide a little bit of context. Marti was the intellectual author of Cuban independence and was responsible for organizing and leading the Cuban Revolutionary Party, which he founded right here in Tampa in 1892. It was here, among the cigar workers of Ybor City, West Tampa, Key West, and other Cuban emigre communities that he found his natural constituency and where he found the inspiration for the future Cuban republic, the Patria that he imagined. Now, because Marti died on the battlefield in 1895, at the very beginning of the war, and because he left behind such an extensive, fascinating, and inspiring body of work, he was quickly turned into a symbol that could be used by the many different and contentious factions that made up the new Cuban Republic to justify their political and social programs after independence was finally achieved. And so Marti became Cuba's national hero, its greatest exponent. Some would say that Marti invented Cuba and Cuban identity. And as such, he has been co-opted and used by every political constituency on both sides of the Florida Straits to defend whatever definition of Cubanness they choose to believe. Marti has become something akin to a secular saint, and like most saints, his life has been turned into a myth. And myths, though sometimes useful, often blind us to the truth. And this brings me to my main point about tonight's talk. Dr. Alfred Lopez is a courageous man. Taking on Marti from as an objective a stance as possible is a courageous act and a necessary one. If Cubans and scholars of Cuba are going to move past the historical and ideological conflicts that have divided them for over a century and that continue to divide them, then Jose Marti must be recovered. He must be disinterred from the many mythologies that obscure his greatest achievement, which was to bring all Cubans, black and white, rich and poor, those abroad and those at home, together in the cause of a future nation dedicated, in Marti's words, to the radical respect for the dignity of man and to freedom of thought, equality of treatment, and peaceful labor. Dr. Lopez's extraordinary biography of Marti is an important step in that direction because it provides us with an opportunity to step back from the hagiography and mythologizing around Marti and see him for the truly remarkable thinker, writer, and political organizer that he was. And so it is only fitting that we welcome Dr. Alfred J. Lopez to Tampa so that he may help us better understand the man behind the myth and, more importantly, to understand what his life and work can teach us in our own tumultuous and uncertain present. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I present to you our distinguished guest, Dr. Alfred J. Lopez.
James, what a lovely introduction. I don't feel courageous. I got some hate mail. I had to send a cease and desist letter to some people, but you know, in the 1970s, I would have been car bombed. So you know, we're all right. It's all good. Fingers knocking on whatever this is. It looks like wood. Anyways, thank you all for being here. I'm especially grateful. I'm especially grateful to see so many folks here under the age of 40 because before I get started here, I want to share with you, faculty members in the audience will find this either funny or horrifying. Many years ago, I was a hopeful applicant for a National Endowment for the Humanities fellowship for precisely this book. And I did not get a fellowship. There was one reviewer, you know, you just remember these things. You just carry them with you your whole life. There was one reviewer whose entire report on my proposal was a single sentence. The sentence read, I remember it verbatim, like 10 years later. The sentence read, and I quote, Jose Marti is the height of antiquarianism, end quote. So that anonymous reviewer would have been mildly surprised to see all of you here today. So I thank you once again for coming to learn about and appreciate the life and work of a guy who died 126 years ago, but about whom many of us are very, very passionate. I'm going to read a little bit, but I'm not going to read big bits. Instead, I want to sort of share some general background with you because I know that some folks are always, in Miami, this would be a very different presentation because everybody in Miami thinks they already know everything about Jose Marti. So I know that you don't think that. So I'm just going to begin with this. Everybody knows who this guy is. You don't have to be Cuban to know who Fidel Castro was, right? One of the most universally recognized figures of the 20th century. Y'all know that. Well, people over 50 maybe know who this guy is, right? Ask your folks or your grandparents. They'll tell you about I Love Lucy, Des Yarnaz. I know y'all know who this is, right? And yet, it's actually pretty remarkable that this man, who was one of the arguably 5 or 6 most important Latin Americans of his century, of the century that followed, is arguably one of the half a dozen to a dozen most important, you know, figures of the history of the Western Hemisphere in terms of political thought, literary achievement, like just a giant. And yet roughly 95% of the population of the northern half of the Western Hemisphere wouldn't be able to pick him out of a lineup. It's remarkable. In Cuba, Jose Marti is, you can't hardly cast your eyes anywhere without seeing an image or seeing the name of Marti. That's the 1 peso note currently circulated in Cuba, except by tourists. And on the flip side of that, you can see the image of the revolutionaries. You can see Fidel's image on the top of that. That's partly because the Cuban Revolution, starting in 1953, long before they actually took power over the island, were very keen on associating themselves with the image and the words and the name of Marti. There's Fidel Castro this was an image from, let's say, roughly 1970 or 71. He loved to have his picture taken in proximity to Marti. That statue you're looking at was actually designed and built by the previous dictatorial regime, Fulgencio Batista's regime, but the revolution embraced it and promptly took it over and pretended they had built it. This is a very popular site for Fidel to give speeches in front of Marti's, approving image, right? There are hundreds of images of Fidel posing in front of a picture of Jose Marti. Not an accident, not a coincidence. This is a man who very carefully built not only his own persona and image, but he built an image of himself in proximity to and in association with the one historical Cuban figure that everybody agreed was the greatest of the great, one man, Mount Rushmore, right? And so there's lots of these. I picked 2 or 3. This is an image from the first tomb. It's the rebuilt tomb of Martí in Santa Ifigenia in Santiago de Cuba, where his the remains of his remains are, this is a picture of Fidel when he was actually briefly imprisoned in Cuba in 1953, 52, Moncada 53, 1953. And here again, he's constantly posing in front of pictures of Jose Marti because he wants that association. Marti's name is on the airport. It's the first name that tourists see when they fly into Cuba. His name's on the National Library. There are tourist sites that people go to in Cuba. One of them is the Birthplace House, which I'm told might be cooler than Elvis's birthplace house in Tupelo, Mississippi. I'm not sure about that because that's a pretty cool place. But anyway, this is a tourist destination. Also, the prison site, the rock quarry where Marti, as a 17-year-old, y'all think about this. Be 17 years old and sentenced to hard labor in a prison camp and bust rocks for 9 months. That's what happened to him. And so that's one of the sort of places where people do pilgrimages. Y'all in the back can't see this very well, but I'm going to, for the benefit of, I'm just going to talk louder. The image up here in the center of this is the National Shrine that somebody has in their backyard. It's actually a house in Coral Gables, Florida. The image is of it's a little tiny self-portrait that Marti drew of himself, kind of doodling in a notebook one day, and it's been reproduced in all kinds of ways. And this person had it cast in apparently iron in their house. It's part of the Marti Shrine. So the devotion to Marti and the sort of iconography, this sort of history of images and sort of honorifics, and as Dr. James Lopez refers to, the sort of the myth of Marti, right, has been ongoing for 120 plus years, pretty much since the day he died. And that's the most recent monument that I know of in Cuba. It was built during the Leon Gonzalez debacle in 1999-2000. That's a well-known portrait of Marti holding a small child, and pointing accusingly at the U.S. Embassy. Or as the folks on the island like to say, look, if you want to get out of here, you want to get your visa, that's where you got to go over there. Or you lost, the embassy's over there. Yeah. But Miami Cubans aren't left behind, and I know you all have. If you haven't taken the Ybor City tour, you should, and if you should know about those sites because they're very, very important, and I'm going to talk about them in a little while. But right now, I'm going to give you a sort of whirlwind tour of Marti sites in Miami. This particular monument is in front of the Freedom Tower in downtown Miami. This site is in Little Havana, a few miles away. The quotation on the bottom of that, it's too small for most of you to see. La patria es agonía y deber. Patria, the fatherland, is agony and duty. And Jose Marti Park, which is a site I spent a lot of time in as a kid. So there's a lot of named stuff. There's another one in Miami Beach. But my favorites are the schools. There's a charter school named after Marti. And here's my favorite, Lincoln Marti Charter School. Because, Abe Lincoln and Marti, come on. Give it a minute, come on. Yeah. All right, right? The Lincoln Marti Charter School is a K through, it used to be K through 12, now it's K through 8. Anyways, they're also famous for the annual Marti birthday parade through Miami. This is just some old images, but they're some of my favorites. You can see all the little kids in the background dressed up as little campesinos, right? There's the parade footage. My favorite slides are coming up. There's They always have a king and the queen of the parade every year, so that dude in the middle there, the Marti impersonator, he's part of that. There he is. He's a good-looking guy, right? You're right. I'm not sure whether that would be Carmen or Carmita, I'm not sure. But anyway, and my favorite, that's awesome. Probably done with a Sharpie, I think, the little thing on the bottom there. Anyways, so this is a way of introducing a universally beloved figure that Cubans everywhere and Latin Americans, to a lesser extent everywhere, agree is really important, but no one really, there are groups that agree, there are subgroups that agree on the proper, what Marti meant, or what he wanted, or who he really was, or how he felt about the United States, or how he felt about Marxism. Hint, he didn't say very much about Marxism at all in his lifetime. It's 23 volumes. This is how big Marti's complete works are. It looks like this. I got them on my shelf. 23 volumes in hardcover, thousands of pages, hundreds of thousands of words. One short speech in which he directly talks about Karl Marx. one, right? It's maybe 1,000 words long. So this was not somebody that Martí had a lot, well, I'm sure he had lots to say about him, but not in print. Anyways, but we're here to talk about Tampa, partly. So to introduce the two little bits that I want to read, Martí's life is sort of divisible into three phases. There's his birth in Cuba to Spanish parents, loyal Spanish colonial parents, people who supported Spanish rule of Spain. He lived there from his birth in Havana in 1853 until he was exiled, literally kicked out of the country in 1870. That was his first exile to Spain. So that's the first phase of his life as a teenager. The second phase of his life, he's sort of a nomad. He lives in a number of Latin American countries. He lives in Spain. He lives in Mexico City. He lives in Guatemala. He spent about a month in Venezuela before he got kicked out of there. He spent the better part of a decade, 8 years really, sort of leading a nomadic existence and trying to find a home and a place where he would be able to not only live a life, but a place where he would be able to build a revolution, to do the one thing that he spent his entire life working on. This was his life's work, which was how to free Cuba from Spanish rule. This was what the man dreamed about. This is what he was thinking about at breakfast. This is what he thought about walking down the street. This was his purpose in life. He found that place starting in 1881 in New York City, which is where he lived from 1881 until he left for Cuba in 1895 to die. The last 40 days of his life spent on the island. But in between there, he made, we have a local historian, highly respected local Martí scholar, George Salcines, who has unearthed evidence for Martí having made 20 different trips, distinctly different trips to Tampa, at least 20. And I say at least because Martí's travels and his whereabouts between roughly 1890 and 1895 were very hard to pin down, because by 1890 he figured out how to evade the Pinkerton agents. Pre-FBI, we had Pinkerton agents, and the Spanish spies that used to trail his every move. So this book, until 1890, was very easy to write, because if I wanted to know where Martí was on August the 17th, 1887, and where he had breakfast, and who he talked with, and how many times he went to the bathroom, all I had to do was go to the archives and read the spy reports, because they literally tracked his every freaking waking moment for years, right? By 1890, he figured this out. And so his whereabouts become much more difficult to track down. He didn't live in a particular place. He usually didn't spend more than 1 or 2 nights in the same house. He lived in a series of safe houses. He lived the life of a sort of a sleeper cell terrorist. Because in effect, he was living a life always one step ahead of the people that were trying to capture him and people who were trying to track his movements and betray the revolution that he was trying to build. So the last 5 years of Martí's life, from 1890 to 95, were quite intense. Tonight I want to read 2 short bits, and I'm going to pull my phone out so that I don't do what Cubans do, which is stand up and talk about Martí for hours. I'm not going to do that to you. So yeah, I'm keeping an eye on the time. Okay. I won't set an alarm though. I'm just going to do that. I want to read a short bit from the section of the book in which Martí discovers the incredible value of this community of cigar workers in Tampa and in Key West. Primarily Afro-Cuban workers, politically very motivated, ideologically very informed, and just a very engaged and committed and activist group of workers. One of the first organized labor movements in the United States, by the way, is traceable to this town and in Key West in the 1880s and 1890s. Those were among the first collectives of workers who said, that they weren't going to tolerate certain conditions, and they demanded certain wages and so on and so forth. So anyway, Martí has a problem in 1890. Between 1888 and 1890, Martí has a problem. He has a bunch of people who are very excited about revolution. They want to go and kick some Spanish butt. They're ready. But they don't agree on anything else. There are New York Cubans who want a certain kind of government when Cuba gets its independence. There are politically very different, much more progressive, labor-oriented workers in Tampa and Key West who don't want that, who want a different kind of society. Race plays a significant role in this. So there are vast differences between these groups. And of course, even the subgroups within the cities don't agree on much. They didn't meet regularly together, for instance. There were maybe several dozen such groups in Tampa and Key West at the time, all of them plotting on their own, all of them raising money on their own, all of them funding, so-called revolutionaries on their own. No coordination. Whoops. So what Martí accomplishes, arguably his greatest accomplishment as a political organizer, is to somehow take this disparate groups of people, and get them for a brief amount of time to focus on this one task. And part of the reason he was able to do that is he was able to convince all sides to just, focus on the thing that they all agreed on. And to sort of put off other stuff until later. Well, of course, he died later, and so he didn't get to do that. But for a brief window between 1891 and 1895, there was solidarity. And this is part of what I want to read about here. So the bit I want to read about is when Martí first arrives. He gets his first invitation. To Tampa in November of 1891. He receives an invitation to come to Tampa and visit the workers, and he's absolutely thrilled. And he gets on a train, and he comes to Tampa. And this is the bit I want to sort of read a little bit from. Although Martí knew Tampa's exiles to be fervent advocates for independence, he could not have been prepared for the enthusiasm and sheer raucousness of their welcome. His train reached Ybor City late at night on November 25th, and despite a torrential downpour, hundreds of Cubans awaited him. Bands playing, people jostling for the chance to shake his hand, the jubilant crowd formed the procession that more or less spontaneously conducted their pleasantly bewildered guest to the nearby Liceo, that building still stands, I'm told, where an even greater and more jubilant crowd burst into boisterous applause as he climbed the steps. Accounts describe the crowd falling into stone silence. Please note that this is a moment in which a large number of Cuban people are quiet at the same time. Just want to bring that to your, you don't know why that's funny. Accounts describe the crowd falling into stone silence as Martí briefly spoke. Then the mass of happy Cubans converged upon him again in a blur of ovations and handshaking and backslapping. After a time, they carried Martí off literally on their shoulders through the streets of Ybor City in the early hours of a Thursday morning, singing the 10 Years' War era hymn of independence, known as the Bayamo Anthem, and eventually delivering him to the door of host Nestor Carbonell. It was more than he could have dared hope for. Here at last were the revolutionaries of his dreams, Cubans who did not need firing up, whose commitment and ardor were a match for his own. On this night, Martí glimpsed the revolution's future, and it was not in New York. The picture that you're seeing up here is a quite famous one to people who know anything about Martí. It's a photograph taken on the steps of the old Martinez Ybor cigar factory, the place it's now a Scientology center or something. You might know the building I'm talking about in Ybor City. That's the building. I don't believe that the current steps are the same steps. I think those were made as a simulation of the original. But that is the building, and you can. And I'll walk over. Anyways, Tampa is a tremendously important location for the revolutions. Let me read a little more from this passage. The next 3 days were a whirlwind of activity for Martí, with well-wishers and supporters at every turn and crowds packing the Liceo for his speeches. On November 26th, Martí met with representatives from Tampa area revolutionary clubs to help draft a manifesto they called resolutions, which the group then ratified as representing their group's collective beliefs and principles. He gave his first Tampa speech before a crowd that filled every seat and spilled into the aisles and onto the stage around the podium. That night, Martí delivered one of his most famous speeches, which has come to be known by its indelible closing phrase, with all and for the good of all. If you've ever heard that phrase in Spanish associated with Martí, it has its origins here in Tampa at that speech. Con todos y para el bien de todos. Martí's first address to Tampa's Cubans skillfully distilled a decade of revolutionary speeches into a single call for solidarity and support. From his opening portrayal of Cuba as, quote, an altar on which to offer our lives, not a pedestal on which to raise ourselves, end quote, Martí announced his revolution as a collective one, inviting all into a partnership of equals, sacrificing for the common good. He offered a virtual catalog of potential problems and contradictions raised by the revolution's opponents, from lacking enthusiasm to self-interest, from a diminished appetite for bloodshed to fears of racial discord, and he dismissed each with the phrase, "They lie." The end of Martí's speech triggered a reprise of the previous evening as the impassioned Cubans again carried their new champion on happy shoulders, a lot of carrying on happy shoulders, you might have noticed here, through the Tampa streets as they sang hymns to the revolution. The following day marked the 20th anniversary of the wrongful execution in Havana of 8 medical students whom Martí had helped enshrine as the revolution's first martyrs. In keeping with the anniversary's somber nature, Martí traded the rhetorical fire of the previous night for a solemn, even reverent tribute to the students' quote, beautiful and useful deaths, which he urged his audience to celebrate as contributions to a better future. The brief quote here, death gives lessons and examples. Death guides our finger across the book of life. From such enduring invisible ties are woven the soul of a nation, end quote. It becomes a famous speech later referred to as, he refers at the end of that speech to the young martyrs of the revolution as pinos nuevos, new pines. And so that becomes a phrase that is also associated with Martí. Anyways, for the revitalized Martí, the revolution was no longer the sole province of a generation of veterans. It would now fall to a new generation to take up the mantle of the war without repeating its mistakes or succumbing to fear or divisiveness or personal ambition or greed. What Martí saw in Tampa convinced him that the new pines were up to the task. I want to point out here, I'm done with the reading, I want to point out here that one of the reasons that I can tell you that it was raining and how many people were present and where he was carried to what address and what room and all this, the reason I know all this stuff is, again, thanks to Pinkerton agents and Spanish spies who were trailing him, who were in the crowd, who were sort of embedded in the crowd, who were writing reports and sending him back to headquarters, right? So you have to sort of see this through the lens of this very imperiled, endangered man who is doing this work under the nose and very much with knowledge of the sort of ever-present danger to his own life. I won't read about this tonight, but there was, during one of his visits to Tampa, Martí survived an assassination attempt. They attempted to poison him, and that attempt failed. But this is not old musty history. This is people putting their lives on the line daily for a cause. So I want to read one last little bit to give you a further sense of the way in which a history that we now accept and that we sort of have received as a done deal. I hope that you have history professors who know how to dodge that sense of history as something done, because it could have turned out 30 other ways, sometimes because of conditions and just quirky things that had nothing to do with planning or foresight. They were just things that happened, contingencies, that could have led to radically different outcomes. So the bit I want to read from here, and I'll close after this, and I'll be happy to take questions, has to do with Martí's final days. It takes, if you look at a map between Dominican Republic and the island of Cuba, you could make that boat trip in a few hours. It took them 10 days, not because they lacked sort of, sailing skills, but because they couldn't figure out how to get there without drawing attention from the Spanish Navy, from the U.S. Navy, from the Coast Guard, from people who were, his face was on wanted posters, and so he couldn't be seen. And so it took them 10 days to get from, if you've ever been on vacation in the Dominican Republic, you know what I'm talking about. Like, imagine taking 10 days between these two little islands. That's how sort of fraught with peril this voyage was. So I want to read a little bit from these final days before Martí lands in Cuba. I'm fast forwarding you now to 1895, which is the very end of his life, the last year of his life, and what happened. And in this passage that I'm going to read, Martí is not even really a featured person. He's in it, but really the star of this passage is all of the quirky things that had to happen for him to get from point A to point B. So I'm going to start reading. The voyage from Montecristi, Dominican Republic, to Cuba was a circuitous and perilous one. 10 days spent alternately at sea or in hiding, under constant threat of discovery and capture. That they reached Cuba at all was due to improvisation, the timely intervention of friends, and on at least one occasion, dumb luck. The Gomez I'm referring to is Maximo Gomez, who was the military head of the revolution, who was traveling with Jose Marti at the time. So Gomez, Martí, and 4 of their fellows set out at sunrise on April 1st. Within hours, the Spanish vice consul in Montecristi wired the news to his counterpart in Santo Domingo, who in turn notified the Cuban authorities. The rebels were reported traveling westbound toward Haiti, and the Haitian consulate was also notified. Due to a lack of wind, it took the schooner brothers 33 hours to cover less than 140 miles. That's worse than Miami traffic, friends. Y'all are a tough crowd. Reaching the Bahamian island of Great Inagua in the early evening of April 3rd to take on supplies. This first stop confirmed for the revolutionaries and their hired crew just how dangerous this trip was going to be. While docked, the Cubans narrowly missed being discovered when a port official demanded to search the vessel, which was full of guns and so on. A later customs search actually uncovered a cache of revolvers, which Martí managed to persuade officials were for the passengers' personal protection. Yeah, there's 6 of us and like 47 guns and 12 boxes of ammo. It's just us. It's just for us. The vessel's owner had suspiciously disappeared during all this, returning only to inform the passengers that the crew had deserted. Martí and Gomez spent the next 24 hours trying to hire a replacement crew and found none. The former captain, John Bastian, had clearly lost his nerve, yet the Cubans could not risk a falling out with him, lest he betray them to the authorities. They had bought the craft, but without a crew, they were stranded and a sitting duck for Spanish spies. The best Martí and Gomez could do was to coerce the captain into returning part of the money they had paid him and hope for an opportunity to escape the island before being captured. It is not clear how Martí managed to send word of their predicament to a sympathetic diplomat, a man named Barves, that's all we know about him, who served as Haiti's consul at Great Inagua. Without Barves' timely intervention, the Cubans' departure would have been significantly delayed and their risk of capture dramatically increased. The Haitian consul put Martí in touch with a Captain Heinrich J. Lowe of the German cargo ship Nordstrom, who agreed, for a significant sum, to carry the expedition to Cuba. So I'm going to skip a little bit and take you to, and I want to say, in the midst of all this, he's writing letters. He writes something like 15 letters during these 10 days. So you're hiding in a ship's cargo hold. You are being chased by everyone and everything, and you are cranking out letters. His correspondence during this period is remarkable. Very, very focused and sort of, it's amazing stuff to see. Anyways, so I want to read this last bit, which is they are now stuck on Cap Haitien on the island of Haiti. They're staying in the house of a man, a supporter of theirs named Opiano de Lunde, who is harboring them in his house at great personal risk to himself. This is another one of those coincidences, another one of those quirks that just happened to work out. It turns out that his godson, in small town, these things happen. So the gentleman's godson happened to be the telegraph operator for this small town at the time, small town in Cap Haitien. And so you'll see why this is important when I read this. So The order finally arrived for the Cubans' arrest. Their presence had been detected despite their best efforts, and at 12:05 p.m. on April the 9th, the arrest order arrived in Capaitan, along with news that a Spanish warship had been sent to collect the Cubans. The expeditionaries were saved by the unlikeliest of heroes, part-time telegraphist Jose Aran, who happened to be on duty when the order came, and happened to be Ulpiano de Lunde's godson. Aran immediately ran to his godfather's house to alert Martí. That evening, the Cubans gathered on board the Nordstrand, where they hid until the ship departed at 1 p.m. the next day. For those of you keeping score, that's roughly 24 hours in the ship's hold. Aran did not deliver the telegram to its destination until the next day, when the danger had passed. The 6 men remained concealed in their cabins even after the Nordstrand's departure for fear of being spotted by a passing vessel or a crew member who might alert the authorities. So I'm going to skip a little bit because there are more letters here that Martí writes. Yes, he's hiding in a cargo hold of his ship writing letters to people. It's amazing. A little OCD going on there, but yeah. He has a real sense of purpose, this guy. This is the last bit that I'll read, and then I'll be happy to we'll just have a conversation. So the Nordstrand, the ship that they've ended up on has a problem. It's a large ship. It's a cargo ship. It's way too deep to get anywhere close to the island. You can't dock that thing just anywhere because it's this enormous shipping vessel. And so what they ended up doing was getting into a rowboat in the middle of the night, about a mile out from shore. If you've ever tried to row a boat in open ocean, you know just how ridiculous that proposition is. But that's what they did. So this is the last bit I'm going to read. Clouds started swirling well before nightfall. By the way, this information, a lot of this is available. I drew a lot of this from the war diaries that General Maximo Gomez published after the war ended, and became just invaluable primary eyewitness testimony for a lot of things. So a lot of this is drawn directly from General Gomez's sort of first-hand account of what happened. Clouds started swirling well before nightfall on April 11th, the seas growing rough enough to rock even the Nordstrand's substantial bulk. General Gomez and Captain Lowe had agreed that the ship would come no closer to shore than 3 miles, from which point the invaders would proceed in a smaller boat. The Nordstrand soon reached the agreed-upon limit, but under a downpour so torrential, because things aren't bad enough, now it's also raining, under a downpour so torrential that the small boat was unlikely to reach the shore. The heavy cloud cover left them in a near-pitch darkness that Gomez later described as, quote, a black funeral shroud that might envelop us forever, unquote. Captain Lowe then took the ship closer to within 1 mile of Cuba's southern coast, an enormous risk for a vessel of that size, I should note. From there, the 6 revolutionaries lowered their rowboat into the rampaging waters. They loaded their guns and supplies, then themselves into the boat, and they started rowing for their lives. Gomez later described the journey's horrific final mile. This bit is my translation of Gomez's account. So this is all a longish quote. Quote, the steamer departed at once and we are left, abandoned to the horror that envelops us. None of us are seamen, but we take to the oars with everything we have. Martí and César at the prow row very badly, but with desperation. The other 3 in the center. I have taken the wheel that I barely know how to operate, which the wind tears from my grip, and I finally lose control of it. The darkness is deep, and the rains grow stronger. We have lost our way and can barely discern the land at all. 2 figures on the shore, who we figure may well be Spanish guards, serve as landmarks, and with extraordinary effort and labor, we head toward them. Unquote. So that's the end of the passage. So they spent an hour doing this. After more than an hour, the storm relented, allowing the fatigued crew to reach the shore. But by 10 p.m., they had not yet found a place to land along the crags and cliffs that lined the shore. Eventually, a small strip of beach, which we now know is called La Playita, is what they call it, offered an opening at the foot of a steep cliff. There they landed, soaked, exhausted, and lucky to be alive. And I thank you very much for your very kind attention. And since I've given you little snippets with not a lot of context in between, I'm totally happy to answer any questions and sort of fill in whatever blanks I can for you. Totally fine.
We had another talk that touched on Jose Marti a little bit earlier in the semester, and a quote was attributed to you. So I guess the first part is mine.
Uh-oh.
I guess the first part is a fact check.
Okay.
No, it's a really great quote, and
Then it was me.
very interested in it. And I think it goes to what you're saying about the incredible volume of Marti's actual output. So the quote said something like, "So few pieces of Martezs are anthologized over and over and over.
Correct.
That people actually have read very little of him and think that they know him."
Yes.
So my question is, as a teacher, what do you think is a piece that's not as anthologized or not as well known that you'd like to see us assign, especially to undergraduates?
Yeah. So the first part of, to address the first part of your question, which is maybe I'll lead up to it. One of the so those of you who grew up in some sort of Judeo-Christian sort of church background, you're familiar with these, particularly if you grew up Catholic or if you grew up in a denomination that believes in saints. You have these, they're little quote books. They're not actually. It's not a Bible. It's not a New Testament. It's actually a little book of passages, quotations. I mean, that kind of thing, by particular saints or by particular famous sayings of Jesus, that kind of thing. This is the level of familiarity that most Cubans actually. This is where they get the stuff, because very, very few people. Okay, so during Martez's lifetime, when he was writing these things, they weren't collected. They were scattered everywhere, and it was only in the 20th century that people started actually trying to gather all this stuff from just all these disparate places. In Cuba, Martí was not read at all because, of course, he was a revolutionary and an enemy of the state, and so his writings were suppressed. And so there are lots of reasons why many people who grew up revering this man don't really know much about him, because what little they've seen of him has been processed in all these ways. So that's the first part. To your point about what to teach, if you're talking about stuff in English, of course, the go-to is Esther Allen's amazing. It's still a state of the art. It's the Penguin editions, selected writings. It's quite remarkable. Obviously, it's not. There's only so much. It's like a greatest hits album for like somebody who has like 30 albums or something. It's not possible to do it all. But it's a remarkable work. And I like to, when I teach Martí, I like to, for my own reasons, I like to use his U.S. writings a lot, because not only because they're more accessible to people in the U.S., but because in them I find them more revealing, not even on a personal level, but his sort of mindset about what he felt, what he thought of modernity, what he thought of the United States, what he thought of, things like the Brooklyn Bridge, which were built in his lifetime, which he went to see. It's a multifaceted set of writings that really reveal a lot about him, and so I like those writings a lot. So anything that he wrote in the U.S., newspaper columns and stuff, are really cool, I think. And you can do that for different majors. Like, for example, the Brooklyn Bridge is a terrific piece for engineering students because he actually gets into the complexities of how this thing was built and the cables and so on. So like there's a Martí for almost every major. Anyways, but thank you for that question.
If I could say something about that,
Yeah.
Esther Allen, back in 2018, she was finally able, after years of lobbying, to have Martí inducted into the New York State Writers Hall of Fame.
Really?
Yes, and it was a really great ceremony. Actually, Colson Whitehead is the one that writes to the little.
You're kidding. That's awesome.
And
The Nickel Boys.
And what's really interesting is there's also a movement afoot to have him included. He lived here for 15 years. And his insights into the United States are very interesting.
Yeah.
They consider Martí as
He's
also a U.S. writer, not just
he's arguably one of the most important American writers of his time.
Yeah.
From any part of America, right? Yeah.
And he's got one for your American Studies. It's a great essay that's in Esther Allen's. It's The Truth About the United States.
Yeah.
It's a good one because one of his arguments is that you want to understand Cuba a little bit, understand the South of the United States. The United
it's important stuff. Yeah, actually, Martí is now in the, ¿Qué placer verlo? I'm so sorry to not have, I tried to get hold of you. Yes.
The 2 days that Martí was traveling by train from New York to come
To Tampa.
Ybor City.
To Ybor City, yes. Yes.
Do you think that he was preparing the 2 speeches that he delivered in Ybor City, or do you think he had already prepared those speeches in New York? Have you found any similar phrases in speeches that he would give in New York, or was this new material that he was bringing to Ybor City?
From what I know of those first hours in Ybor City, his arrival at the train station, and the fact that he was absolutely surrounded by well-wishers and fans and people during almost the entirety. I don't know whether they left him alone to sleep during that first visit. I don't, and this is speculation on my part, but my gut check, my gut feeling would be that, and even for as talented a writer as Martí, who composed speeches sometimes on cocktail napkins and delivered them almost extemporaneously, I don't know that he would have had a lot of time to prepare something as substantial as, con todos y para bien de todos. I mean, it's a lengthy, substantive speech. So my guess, and I would have to, again, go back and compare manuscripts and so on, but my guess would be that he probably had some material prepared. But however, that first speech that he gave at the night of his arrival was most likely an impromptu sort of statement. And we don't have that. We don't have that text, so we don't know what he said that first night. Yeah, but thank you. That's a really great question. I'm not really sure I know the answer, but I'll go find out for you.
It's a 2-day trip.
Yes.
And there's a difference between the first message
Yes.
and then the second message. In the second message, I get what you're indicating, that all of a sudden he's overwhelmed by what he has found in Ybor City, the enthusiasm for independence. Because at one point he says, you all already have prepared it. You all have done the job. So I've never been able to figure out, had he prepared speech number 1 and then speech number 2 previously, or did he prepare in those 2 days that he had of solitary confinement in the Henry B. Plant Railroad coming down to
That's possible as well. I would venture a guess that the second speech, the Nuevos Pinos, the New Pine speech, was one that perhaps he had some preparation for, because of course he would have known the anniversary in advance, and that would have been something that he would have been prepared to speak on, because of course he was involved in the establishment of that anniversary, that important date. But yeah, it's entirely possible that he was still working on those speeches on the train. I couldn't tell you. I don't have enough knowledge of on a manuscript level to know that.
I don't know if this is true, but I know that I heard somewhere that the metaphor for the New Pines was that the train, which he was coming down on the train, that there had been a forest fire in Florida, that he was coming through a forest fire, and that out of the train he saw the new growth coming out of the forest fire.
Hey.
That was the basis of the metaphor. I don't know if it's true or not.
It should be, and so we'll just go with that. I think we're good. I like it. I like it a great deal. But you get a sense for how difficult it is to really know at a distance of even 100 Martí died 126 years ago. The difficulties of really getting close to a historical figure of his magnitude, but also of his. There was a great deal of evasiveness in Martí for very practical reasons. There were reasons for him to not want his whereabouts known and his movements known and his private thoughts known. And so that makes a challenge, quite a challenge for a biographer. Yeah.
Doctor, first of all, thank you for the detailed approach you have taken to, on Jose Marti. I've learned a lot tonight, and you've given me a different perspective
Yes.
So I've never found out, and I know that I've spoken to many, including EJ and so forth, and collaborated to find out if there had been any relationship between them.
I do not know for a certainty whether there was or was not. I do know, I mean, the person most directly involved in Martiz's visit to Tampa was, of course, Nestor Carbonell, who was the head of the biggest club in Tampa at the time, the Ignacio Gramonte Club, who extended the invitation. Whether and I have to tell you, I mean, I've read. I want to say that there are probably letters out there that I have not read, but not many. And I don't have any recollection, I don't know whether you do, I don't have any recollection of any direct correspondence between the two of them. So I want to say that I don't think that they ever directly corresponded with each other. It makes sense to me because Martiz's direct relationship was with the revolutionary clubs and therefore with the workers. So my guess would be no. But you know, people are finding new manuscripts all the time. They're still, and some of them are apocryphal, but some are not. And it may well be that there's some correspondence out there, but it's not in the collected works that I know of. Yeah.
And I agree with that. But New York was the hub. Today we think of Miami as the Cuban capital of the United States. But back then, New York City
It was.
had been the capital, the Cuban capital. All the money Cubans during the 10-year war all came to New York, sent their children to universities in the New York area, etc. So I suspect that in the many trips that Mr. Martinez Ivor and or his partners in the cigar industry, they traveled to New York. They had warehouses in New York. And Marti was one of the prominent spokesmen for the Cuban issue. So I suspect that they probably met.
There,
I don't think that when Marti comes to Martinez Ivor Cigar Factory, that's the first encounter. I think the old man already had known or had met Marti.
And I would add to that there are very, very good reasons. There are very good reasons why someone like Martinez Ivor, someone who had political interests, someone who had financial interests in New York and in Tampa, would not have wanted a meeting. There are many people that Marti met with in a clandestine fashion that we have learned about, and there are many others that he met with in a clandestine fashion that we have never discovered. And so, of course, that's always a possibility. But I would say that there are very good reasons why someone like Mr. Martinez Ivor might not have wanted a meeting with Marti to have been known. This is the part where I get out of the way and I just let them talk.
Se lo confiesa a Isnaga, cuando Isnaga, que trabajaba con él trabajó con él en la revista de Oro, él le confiesa en la carta a Isnaga que va a tener un buen trato con Martín Ivor, que se conocieron en Nueva York, y le da a Isnaga la impresión que él le dio haber conocido a Martín Ivor en Nueva York. Y eso es 1880.
Would you mind saying that in English, what he just said?
That might take a while.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, I'm saying it. No, no, it's fine. Oh gosh, I'm going to paraphrase that. I can't. I don't know. Okay. So if I captured this correctly, so you're saying that there is, no, I've lost it. That there is a connection. Okay, so Martí published a children's magazine, very briefly, I think really 3 issues published, of a magazine called The Golden Age, La Edad de Oro. And so you were saying that there was a connection during that era with, possibly with Martínez Ivor? Huh.
Está la confesión de él, está
Oh, so there's okay. So there is a letter from Marti. Who was it to? Okay, please. That would be great to know. So he refers to that relationship in a letter to a third person. Okay, got it. Okay. Interesting. Anybody else? There's a whole bunch of folks back there that are just.
So I was recently gifted a book of Jose Marti's poems, poetry.
Yes.
Do you have the same respect for his poetry that you do?
Absolutely.
Firebrand, Revolution?
Absolutely. Absolutely. One of the interesting facets of one of the interesting sort of things when you study the sort of not just Marti's life, but the history of how he's been sort of studied since his death, is that depending on which version of him you uncover. So, for example, in Cuba, the revolution, Centro de Estudios Martianos, I mean, politically speaking, they have much less interest in Marti as a poet. There's relatively, if you look at the amount of stuff published on Marti's poetry, it's relatively slim compared to the immense, exponentially larger amounts of stuff published on his political writings. But it's too bad because Marti was, among other things, and by the way, folks, so Marti was, he was a very not good novelist, so don't go read his novel. It's not in English, but you don't need to read it anyway. But he was a really good playwright. He published some, he was a very popular playwright in Mexico, and he was a tremendously important modernist poet who was very highly regarded in his lifetime as a poet. A lot of, so there are many sort of pieces to Marti that make him a remarkable figure, but his poetry is one of them. By the way, I should mention also that there's a very nice, there are two really good bilingual editions of his most famous work, a poetic work of poetry, the Simple Verses, Versos Sencillos, published by the press in Houston called Arte Público is the name of the press, and the translator is a guy named Manuel Tellechea, he spent I think a decade on it. It's very nice. It's a very nice bilingual edition. So you could start there.
That's the one I have.
Yeah, that's an excellent edition. Esther Allen's is good too, but that one's really, really good. Can I say a little bit about Marti as a journalist? Because I think that's worth doing. Make sure what did I do with my phone? Oh, here it is. Okay. So I want to say a little bit about Marti as a journalist, because this is kind of a cool thing to think about. You can upload a blog post now and have it read, in theory, all over the world. In Marti's time, in order for you to be read outside of the immediate vicinity of where you live, you had to mail your article. So you had to stick it in an envelope and send it to the editor at the newspaper. And so this is the stuff I was telling you about earlier. There's a really important series of journalistic writings of Marti, writing about New York City, writing about the Confederacy after the Civil War in the South, writing about things like boxing matches, the first gallery showing of Impressionist art in New York City in 1887, when he's among the first journalists to visit the gallery and write about them. And he says, that Monet guy, he's pretty good. I mean, he had an eye for that stuff. The rest of these people, Gauguin, whatever, but the Monet guy's good. But Marti was, in many ways, the first syndicated columnist. He was read by the educated classes of countries all over the Spanish-speaking educated classes all over the Western Hemisphere, in Mexico, in Caracas, in Buenos Aires. And so if you think about it like that, Marti is tremendously important as a journalist because what he's doing is he's introducing educated Spanish-speaking people, educated Latin Americans. He's giving them an eyewitness view of life in America, right? And so he's interpreting American life for a generation of people who would then develop their own attitudes and their own tastes and their own views of the United States through this one person's eyes. It's a remarkable achievement. And he did it the old-fashioned way. He would type something, and he would fold it up and stick it in an envelope and mail it off and hope it got there. And sometimes they would pay him, and sometimes they wouldn't. And sometimes it would end up syndicated, copied in 3 other newspapers that didn't pay him. Like, it was just it was a precarious existence. But the stuff is tremendously valuable. its impact on a generation of Latin American intellectuals is incalculable. Anyways, I'm going on to her. Other questions, anybody? I know you're out there. I can hear you breathing. Oh, yes. Yes.
Dr. Lopez, thank you for this. I'm wondering, this particular speech, the 401 for the Good of All, was a speech where Martí sort of framed a transnational Cuban identity.
Yes.
He garnered a lot of support from exiles, of course. And yet, from what I understand, one of the things that he wanted to maintain was the Spanish culture influence that was in Cuba. And so where would you kind of put Martí between the decolonial project and one that, sought to be an independent version of Spanish culture?
It's very tricky, right? Martí was the son of Spanish loyalists. He was, in many ways, he was a scholarship kid. He couldn't afford to go to the best schools in Havana. He got, he had a godparent who paid for his schooling, but he had a great education. When he was exiled to Spain, that might have been the silver lining in his being exiled, was that he was able to go to law school in Zaragoza in Spain, and before that he spent a year, more than that, in Madrid, visiting the salons and going to the best libraries and with access to. So this is a young man who had he had a European education. He was fluent in French. He met Victor Hugo. This was not. He's an odd figure to be championing decolonial thought, isn't he? Because in many ways he's a bourgeois intellectual, and he comes from an aspiring middle class background, and he's an odd figure for a revolutionary in some ways, and yet one of the remarkable things about Martí is that he is able in his writing, particularly his later writings, to really transcend his own limitations. And by the way, this is one of the coolest things you can ever learn about a subject that you're writing about for a biography, is to discover, not that they were superhuman and that they were just as great as you thought they were. That's fine. But to discover that they were actually quite human and quite limited in their sort of perspectives on the world, and that their upbringing limited their ability to sort of think broadly about things, and yet that they managed to overcome that and achieve outstanding things, right? Despite having been, having this particularly limited perspective. It's a good lesson for everybody, right? Think outside of your own life. Think outside of your own circumstances, right? Be curious about the world. Meet with people, talk with people who you normally wouldn't. Martí did this his whole life. And so that's part of the answer to your question, is that, so Martí's writing on race, for example, that short essay, Mi Raza, My Race. It's an amazingly progressive piece of writing for the time. He basically says, I don't know, there's no races. What are you talking about? We're all Cubans here. Like, he's trying, it's not cool that people these days who say that they're race blind are doing it for disingenuous reasons. But at the time, he is using race blindness as a way to eliminate what had been a historical problem for Cuban revolutionaries, which was that Spain was using race, literally the fear of a black Cuba, to disenfranchise white Cubans from wanting to get involved in the revolution. And he knew that that was a problem, and he addressed it in this really progressive way, right? But nothing in his upbringing would have allowed him to do that. So that's one of those wonderful things about him that I really admire. I wish I could say the same about his progressive feminist views, but I can't. He just wasn't that kind of guy. Yeah. So I just wanted to preempt that question. Yeah.
Professor, from your university point of view, especially with your publication of Martí, will American literature soon discover Jose Martí and be part of American literature?
I hope so. The only journalist during Martí's lifetime who was as important as he and had the kind of impact he had was Mark Twain. And we all know about Mark Twain, Innocents Abroad, and Mark Twain's writings on the American West. Those are all tremendously important for American literature. We should all be reading in American literature classes, Martez's writings on New York. They're just that important. We should all be reading his poetry in translation. I will tell you as a footnote, not to brag about myself. I do that sometimes, but I was fortunate to be the translator of the first. Martez's first appearance in the Norton Anthology of American Literature was my translation of his essay Nuestra América, and that was his first appearance in it, which was in 2015. So we're making progress. We're moving towards that, I hope.
For 5 years, Martí was the leading poet
Yes,
living in the United States
absolutely.
when Walt Whitman died.
Yes,
But the American public was not aware of this literary giant
no,
because all of his material, or primarily material, was in Spanish.
correct, yeah. As an interesting footnote, Martí actually went to see Walt Whitman, who was an old man. If you think about Madison Square Garden as a new place, just newly built, Walt Whitman was one of the first sort of marquee sort of hot tickets. He, as an older man in the 1880s, he would go on tours and he would read from he would recite his poetry. And Martí was, as we know, Martí was present in the audience at Madison Square Garden to see Walt Whitman. And we don't know for sure that they actually met, but we think they did because there was a small reception afterwards, which Martí attended. Yeah, so if they did meet, that conversation would have to have taken place in English because Whitman did not speak Spanish and his French was very poor. And so they would have had to speak in English. Yeah. I think that's a cool idea. Martí sitting in the back of a room like this watching Walt Whitman. I think that's kind of, I don't know. I think it's kind of awesome. Oh, Captain, my Captain. I don't know. I think it's kind of cool. I think it's kind of cool. Anyways, anybody else? Are we good? I don't know.
If anyone is interested in purchasing the book, it's not ready on time, but we have a QR code that will be placed on the podium now, and you can just scan it and order it that way. And thank you again for.
And if enough folks buy it, I will get in a car in December from Miami and come here and sign the damn things.